welcome to another episode of the YLP Hockey PodKass. I'm your host, Josh Cass, and we are sponsored by the Weiselberg Law Firm. For nearly 20 years, you've entrusted Elliot with the growth and guidance of your kids, and now it's time to let him do the same for your family's most important asset, your home. Admitted in both New York and New Jersey, Elliot can help guide you through any residential or commercial purchase, sale, refinance, or lease, and he'll do it with championship quality and award-winning care. If you're looking for your commercial coach or a new home is your goal, please reach out to the Weiselberg Law Real Estate Services today. You can call 917-952-2597 or send them an email wiselawesc@gmail.com. I want to remind everyone, once again, that's the Weiselberg Law Firm. Please choose wisely. So we're back in action here. Third episode of the season, our fourth total season, our third full season. And with that being said, this is going to be the first episode of the season where we go over a little bit in JV and a little bit in varsity. I'm going to break it down for you guys. Today, our topic is really just another update around the league, and we're going to go back and look at some of the past games that I mentioned in the previous episodes, as well as some more games to look forward to for future episodes. And with that being said, we're going to start with JV. Let's get right into it. So the last thing I talked about in JV really was just what to expect from the league. I talked about some of the games coming up, and what could really surprise us, what might not surprise us, sort of the expectations. And, I think that, again, it's been a very, very surprising season. Remember, only 8 teams in JV. Last year, there were 9. The league had a clear team that seemed to be far and away above the top, and that was SAR last year. And DRS was close, but not close enough. And, they were the team that lost. But, going back to that, once it was really SAR at the top, yes, DRS made the championship, but they were, a group of teams that were right there, really also who could have been in the mix. Frisch, Hafter, YDE, just to name a few. And when you look at it, the concept of it was that there were also the other teams. Well, those were the teams in the playoffs. They all legitimately had a shot. Even the teams that had just missed the playoffs also had a shot. TABC had a rough schedule last year. Same thing with MTA. Same thing with Ramaz. You look at it and say it was really, yes, a team at the top in SAR, but after that, a lot of unknowns or a lot of wild cards for what could have happened. This year, it is a little bit less of there's a clear team at the top, or really a lot more of a less team at the top. And, coming into the year, there would have been a team that didn't seem to be as high on the top as last year. And now it's really just more of a wide open league. And the only thing that this season has done is really prove that and carry that narrative forward even more as the JV season has progressed. So at the time of recording this, it's Thursday night, December 12th. So all of the numbers I'm about to go over include the most updated version of the standings. So right now in the Eastern Conference, we'll go through the standings. We have DRS in first, they're 6-1. YD's in second, they're 4-2-0-1. That 0-1 is a tie. Hafter's in third, they're 2-3-2-1. So they have 2 wins, 3 losses. They've lost twice in overtime, and they've tied a game. And then you have Rambam in last, they're 0-8. And then in the West, you've got Frisch, who is now 7-1. They were 7-0, but we'll get to that. SAR is right behind them. They're in second. They are 5-1-0-1. That 0-1 is also a tie. TABC is in third. They are 2-3-0-1. That 0-1 is also a tie. And MTA is 1-6. So I'll get straight to the point. I think it's pretty clear at this point Rambam and MTA have pretty much run themselves right out. They're not in playoff contention anymore. As for the remaining teams, and it's possible also Hafter could find it a little bit difficult to get in because Hafter has played right now at least a total of 8 games. Their ceiling for wins is 4, which means that their ceiling for points is 11. So DRS has already clinched or has already at least clinched being second in the division. So that could put them in a good spot to make the playoffs. Right now, they're 6-1. They've got 3 games left, and there's some notable games coming up. YDE is not far behind them at 4-2-0-1. DRS sitting at 12 points, YDE sitting at 9, separated by 3 points. And guess what? They're going to match up again. I'll get to that. And then you look at the Western Conference and you say MTA's 1-6. They've played 7 games. Their ceiling for wins is 4, but that also means that their ceiling for points is 8. Right now they're at 2 points, and It doesn't look like they're going to get there right now, just based on what they've got coming up still. Um, you've got TABC, who's still very much in the mix at 2-3-0-1. They could still go 6-3-0-1. So that could definitely be interesting. And that would mean that their total for points, if you tack on another 4 wins, which translates to 8 points, is 13. So they could still jump SAR. They can't jump Frisch anymore. So TABC's ceiling for a finish would be second place in their division. And SAR is 11-5-0-1. And their ceiling for points, that means they played a total of 7 games, is another 6 points, which means that they could get to 17 points. And Frisch, who's 7-1, is at 14 points. They're 3 points ahead of SAR, but the one loss in their 7-1 record is a cause of a game that they played against SAR that they lost. Frisch right now is 7-1. They have a maximum of 18 points that they could get to with 2 more games remaining. So they could finish 9-1. And if they win at least one more game, then that should allow them to pretty much lock it up. The challenge for them, or it wouldn't exactly, they'd be at 16 points. SAR can get to a maximum still of 17, but they've already played SAR twice. And the 2 games that remain for Frisch are TABC and DRS. I'll get to that. So just a rundown, really, though, of the divisions and where the teams stand. So a little bit of the update. That's where they are in terms of the standings, as I mentioned. What we're going to go through now are some of the past games that we've seen over the last couple days or week or so since the last episode came out. Keep in mind, last episode came out. Things happening since the time it was uploaded. So just some past games that were notable in JV, though. We had the DRS Wildcats beating the TABC Storm. That was not this past Saturday night or Mote Shabbos, but the Saturday night before that. That was at TABC. DRS beat them 4-1. That same Mote Shabbos, YDE hosted Hafter and beat Hafter 5-2. Earlier on, at a point earlier in the season, Frisch had hosted it. I don't know if it was hosted or on the road, but Frisch had beaten SAR 4-0. And most recently, what just happened on this past Thursday, or really tonight at the time of recording this earlier, is that Frisch fell to SAR by a score of 7-3. And that is the game that ended Frisch's perfect season, undefeated season. So now no team is going to go undefeated in JV. You were looking at Frisch, they were at 7-0. It was possible, but it did not happen. And in addition to that, in another recent game, DRS, or yeah, it was, I believe it was earlier this week on Monday that DRS had defeated Hafter in Hafter 1-0 in a game that went down to the wire. So definitely an interesting bunch of games there. And that's sort of where it is, because DRS is going to play YDE coming up next. That's going to be a game for them that they're really going to need if they want to try to secure that Eastern Conference. And YDE can, if they can win that game from DRS, that'll put them just a point behind DRS. They'll go 1-1 in the season series because they played DRS twice. And then they're looking at 2 games coming up against one TABC on Monday, December 16th, which will be the first game of next week's matchups. And then in very early January, they're going to take on SAR at SAR. So they're 3 difficult games for YDE in terms of them being able to jump in the standings. But they've been able to play well against really everyone. You're looking at what they've done so far, and their most recent victory was a blowout win over Rambam. They beat them 12-1. But before that, I mentioned the Hafter game that they won. They beat MTA in a close game, the week or 2 prior. They tied Hafter earlier. And when they played DRS earlier on in the season, they lost 4-0. But I was told by people who were at that game that game could have been a game that YDE still could have won. I don't remember if I mentioned it in the previous episode I did with JV, but just to give you an idea, this YDE team is not going down without a fight. They're not just going to sit in second place and say, we're in second place. That's good enough. We'll hope we get a wild card. They want to go for it all, and they want the division title in the Eastern Conference. And as for what we have in terms of DRS, they're right now at 6-1. It's, they've got they've got a lot of the work out of their way that was really going to define where they could end up. And they beat Hafter most recently earlier this week. They beat TABC the week before, or really Yeah, the week before by a couple of days. But DRS right now, other than that 4-2 loss to SAR, has really been in control. They opened their season with a win against Hafter, and the interesting thing, and this is a very interesting thing, DRS has had a shutout in every single game except for the TABC game that they won 4-1 on Motzei Shabbos and the SAR game, which they lost. Any other game, they've shut out Hafter. They've shut Rambam out twice. They shut out YDE. I know I said YDE could have potentially beaten them based on what I heard, but they shut out YDE. This is they're clamping down defensively. This is a team that may not necessarily go and score the doors off of teams consistently, but they're not going to give goals up consistently. That seems to be a narrative we're seeing from them. And it's always been DRS's motto. We're going to play defense first. Even with the coaching change, as I mentioned, they are still proving to be a very elite team. Now, if you go on towards the West, as I mentioned, Hafter, or actually before we go on to the West, just to sort of lock in the rest of what we have with Hafter and Rambam. Rambam's already 0-8, and the only two games that they have remaining on their schedule are to Hafter and TABC. So unfortunately, I don't think that the end of their season fares very well for them. If I had to make a prediction, I'd probably predict them going 0-10. But you never know. We could see something different happen. And then if you go back towards Hafter, who's also in an interesting spot, I mentioned they can't climb any higher up than to end up in second place in their division because their max for points is 11. Right now they're at 7. They've got Rambam coming up, who they should beat, and they've got MTA coming up, who they probably should beat, but it'll be an interesting game. MTA is usually able to stay in most games because of their goaltending, even though they're 1-6. But we'll get there. Moving on, so that really does it for the Eastern Conference. I would sort of predict the standings to stay the way that they are. Maybe YD and Hafter could change, but that, I don't know. It's going to depend on who makes the playoffs based on the wild cards, because we know the division winners at this point are likely going to be DRS and Frisch, but then there are two wild cards, and is it going to be SAR and TABC? Is it going to be SAR and YDE? Is it going to be YDE and TABC? Is it going to be Hafter and TABC? We'll see. Anything could really happen. But MTA and Rambam have both been mathematically eliminated from the playoffs already. That is what we have as a given in terms of teams making it or not making it. You go on to the Western Conference now, and you look at the Frisch Cougars. They're 7-1. Frisch does not have the easiest schedule remaining. They're going to go up against TABC, although it's going to be in Frisch, and they're going to go to DRS. That's going to be in February. So a long time until that happens. It's going to be interesting. TABC is going to need that game against Frisch in order to try to keep their playoff hopes alive, because right now they're not mathematically out, but they're in a tight spot. TABC has a very good team on paper, as I've mentioned. For them, it was really just going to be about putting it all together, and, we'll see what happens there. But Frisch and TABC are going to play each other one more time. That game is going to be a week from this coming Monday on December 23rd. And then DRS is going to host Frisch for Frisch's last game of the season. That's going to be in early February. So, that's a long way down the road. That game may not really mean anything for both teams, but we'll see what happens, and we'll definitely get to that. When we get to that, we'll definitely talk more about it. You look at the SAR Sting. SAR is in a very good spot to be able to lock up a playoff spot. They're going to play YDE in early January. That's SAR's next game. Keep in mind, YDE's got, that's YDE's last game. That's SAR's next game. And then after that, they're going to play TABC again. They tied earlier in the regular season at TABC. That'll be an interesting game. And then SAR gets to close it out at MTA, where that was the first team that they played on the regular season. They beat MTA. So it'll be interesting to see what happens there. MTA is already mathematically out, but I doubt they're just going to crawl up and, that they're going to curl up into a ball and hide the rest of the season. I expect them to give every team that they're playing, their best shot, trying to say, other than the fact that, hey, we want to play for some pride here, is, you don't have a free ride when you come and play us. That is really what it is for Frisch and for SAR. And now talking about TABC, who is very much still alive in the playoff race, but not in the greatest of positions. TABC's next game is going to be Monday night on December 16th against YDE. And Frisch is going to take them on next. I mentioned that on Frisch's schedule, a week after that YDE game. And then they're going to go to SAR, a team they tied, but they tied them in TABC. SAR usually plays better at home. And to close it out, they get Rambam but that game may not matter for TABC if they're mathematically out. If they're not mathematically out and say they need to win to get in and they get Rambam, I would say that really favors them. But until we know what happens, these are all games that could go either way. We've seen YDE play up to opponents, and YDE's been a solid team this year. And it'll be interesting to see also when they're at home, they're a much better team. That'll be very interesting to see because TABC has had a little bit of unfortune going on the road this season and taking some tough losses. We saw it against Hafter, we saw it against Frisch. Are we going to see it against YDE next week on Monday? I'm not sure, but we'll find out. You're looking at Frisch hosting TABC. Frisch already beat them in TABC, but it was a close game really until the third period. I don't know. Maybe the bigger gym will help TABC and their guys who bring a lot of speed and can run. Maybe it'll be something better for them. Who knows? You're looking at SAR. SAR and TABC tied earlier on. These are all games that you can look at and say they could go either way for TABC. It's just a matter of maybe if they get a couple bounces here and there because they've been experiencing a little bit of bad luck so far throughout their season. Because most of their games, they've really been in and they've controlled. Even the DRS game that they lost 4-1 on Motzei Shabbos. I was there and they played fine. You're looking at a couple point shots from faceoffs they just didn't win that were cleanly won back and shot and scored. And other than that, like play in terms of who had the better play, you could make the argument that they've had the better play in almost all of their games. So the record doesn't really favor them, but this isn't a team that I'm expecting to just die. If they've got a shot for the playoffs, it's TABC. They're one of the most successful hockey schools in the Yeshiva League in its history. I expect them to give everything they've got to try to get in. And if you get in, you never know what could happen. And even though I said MTA is already mathematically eliminated, as I said, I still expect them to bring their best effort forth against every team they're going to play. They're not just going to crawl into the corner and hide and let you take it to them. Like they're going to do everything they can to spoil it for other teams because this is a team that despite their record, they play hard and they have been in most of, if not all of their games this season. Moving on to, because that really wraps it up for JV. So again, I'm not going to make a prediction for who's going to end up where in terms of the wild cards, but I think that what we know so far, what we're experiencing right now in this JV league is that DRS and Frisch seem to be in the best positions to wrap up their divisions. Both teams only one loss on the regular season. They're going to play each other, though, at the end of the season. It's going to be an interesting game. Definitely could be a lot. For Frisch, it might come down to if they can win the West. What if SCR storms back and they're a point ahead and Frisch can get more points than them and they need to beat DRS? What if YDE jumps and tries to, take the lead in the division over DRS? Then that'll be a very interesting game to look out for between DRS and Frisch at the end. But for right now, I would say that both teams could put their divisions away officially, and mathematically clinch before it comes to that point. But we'll see what happens. It'll definitely be interesting. And even the wild card shifting is going to be interesting around to see what happens with Hafter and YDE in the East, as well as SAR and TABC in the West. So good luck to all of the teams in JV that still have a shot. And, hopefully we'll be set for some great matchups come playoff time, and not just playoff time, but maybe getting into the playoffs to see who can secure those final spots. Now we're going to move on to varsity. As I mentioned, JV is a very small league. It's not such a big breakdown, but that's really everything there was. So we move on to varsity. And in varsity, we're going to pretty much do the same things. We're going to talk through where the divisions stand, but we're not exactly going to give the entire rundown because there's some teams that have already been eliminated or mathematically seem to be out of the running for making the playoffs. And then what we're going to do is we're also going to talk about some of the past games as well as some of the notable games coming up, as I did on the last episode. So really, it was just a combination of, the first and second episode put into one, but we're sort of just trimming it down a little bit. So again, it's Thursday night and it's late and, just to talk about where the standings are in regard, or where all the teams are in regard to the standings right now. So we got in the East, which we'll start with again, DRS in first, they're 8-0. Hafters in second at 7-1. North Shore's in third at 7-2. YDE is in fourth, they're 5-3-1. Hank is in fifth, they're 5-3, and that's it. Excuse me, they're just 5-3. Flatbush, so we'll go a little bit past, but Flatbush is in sixth, and that's and they're 5-4. And we'll cap it with Rambam, who is in seventh at 3-6-1. So in terms of just, I'm not going to go over the maximum points and everything. It is a much bigger league, and we don't really have that much time for it. But DRS is sitting right now alone in first place. Hafter is right behind them at 7-1. DRS is at 8-0. I expect DRS to stay at the top of their division throughout the rest of the regular season. As for now, just go down a little bit. As for Hafter 7-1 right now. They just experienced their first loss of the season last night against Hank. And Hank won that game without Elia Yitzhaki in the lineup. His brother Daniel got married that night. So first of all, mazel tov to the Yitzhaki family. But second of all, very, very huge win for Hank there because as I mentioned right now, they're in fifth place. They're 5-3. And they were even though they had a tough start to their season with a game against DRS and a game against SAR, and they dropped a recent game to Flatbush, as I'll get there. But, it was tougher than they really needed a big win here. And against a Hafter team that was undefeated coming in was going to probably be their toughest test of the season up until, that point. Because, yes, they had played close with YDE and Rambam and Kushner, but they really hadn't gotten, at least in my opinion, a test from a team that could have potentially looked like they'd be better than them on paper during the regular season. And so they got that in Hank and they went to Hank. I was talking to Zach Newmark for just a couple minutes right after the game, and he said, this is one of the most annoying gyms for us to come into. We don't really like playing here. We haven't had a lot of success. And, not to say the team really played that poorly, but Hank really dug deep to get this win. And they didn't pull away until late in the game. Like it was 1-0 Hank, then it was 1-1. Then it was 2-1 Hank, then it was 2-2. And then after that, Hank got a late goal in the third period, and then one became two and two became three, and that's really just where it stood as the separation for the rest of the game. So this Hafter team definitely still strong and definitely still could make a lot of noise finishing off the rest of the regular season. It's going to be interesting for them. They're going to get DRS next week on Monday, but after that they get North Shore, they get Mag and David. They should be able to if they lose that DRS game, they should be able to rebound with wins there. They're going to play DRS again. They're going to play Frisch after that, and they're going to close it out with Hank. That's a very difficult 3 games to close out your season, especially if they could still be fighting for the first place spot in their division. So it'll be interesting to see. But we're looking at that, and I think Hafter is going to be a safe playoff team. The question for me is going to be where are they going to finish in the standings. You're looking at North Shore just beyond them. They're 7-2. North Shore also very interesting stuff. They just most recently lost a couple weeks ago to, or excuse me, not a couple weeks ago. They lost earlier on to DRS. That game ended with a final score of 7-0. And other than that, they most recently beat YDE, a team they beat in overtime, but they went to YDE and they did it there. They did fall to Flatbush in a game that was high scoring, 10-7 the final score there. I heard Joe Catton scored like 7 goals in that game for Flatbush. So he's starting to come alive, it looks like. And other than that, though, the victory against Hillel, they've beaten Solomon. This is a team in North Shore, in other words, that hasn't really faced their fair share of dominant teams yet. And yeah, they beat Ramaz, who's an interesting team in the West, and they've beaten YDE, a team that plays hard in the East, who's in the playoff mix right now. But DRS is really a team that I look at and I say they are a favorite to win the league this year. And North Shore, a team who's looked strong so far, didn't seem to have a lot of success against them. So it shows you a fact that yes, DRS is sort of in their own tier compared to North Shore, but North Shore definitely still has things to look forward to. And as I know I haven't mentioned it yet, but I'll get to their coming schedule. They're going to play Flatbush, but that game will be in North Shore, so I would still look at them probably as the favorites there. They're going to go to Hafter. It'll be a tough game for them, but you never know. This team has certainly shocked us before with some games, especially 2 years ago on the JV level. They're going to play Hank at North Shore. I would expect Hank to win that game, but at North Shore, they're a different team. And then they closed the season out with Solomon Schechter and Rambam. Like, this is a North Shore team where if I were to mark it down right now, I could say that they could win 9 games, maybe more. So it'll definitely be interesting to see what happens with them. You go back to third place now, or excuse me, not third, fourth, YDE, and we'll sort of, we'll group YDE and Hank together because they're 4 and 5. I do think Hank is ultimately going to jump YDE. But YDE right now also, they haven't really been in against they haven't played the most dominant teams in the league yet. Like a couple close games against Rambam, a close game that they lost against Hafter, a couple close games that they lost to North Shore. The only team that I'm looking at and saying that they really, I would say the most dominant team that YD has played up until this point is Hafter. And, most recently, Hafter only beat them 3-0 just a few days ago. earlier in the season have to beat them 7-1. But again, as I mentioned in JV, it's the same thing in varsity. YDE is a different team when they're at home. So interesting to see what they do going forward. Where do I think they could end up? I mean, it's difficult. They are still going to play DRS again, and they're going to play Hank again. It's if I had to put a prediction just based on what I had seen and what I'm not really 100% sure about, like the only givens I could really say that I would predict are that they would probably beat Solomon Schechter and Aureus Roll. And right now they're sitting at 5 wins. So I could say that I would believe, or I'd be pretty confident in them at least getting to 7 wins. But, we'll see what happens. It'll definitely be very interesting to see what happens with this YDE team. And look, they play hard and they're going to be in almost all of their games. So that's why it's going to be interesting for me to see what happens and for the rest of the league to see what happens when they play DRS and when they play Hank and when they play Flatbush, teams that have seemed to also be in the mix. And then going back to Hank, as I mentioned, I think they'll jump the teams that, maybe the first two teams that are ahead of them. I don't know about Hafter at this point, even though they beat them just because of the way the numbers check out. But they already beat Mag and David earlier on in the year by a large margin. I would expect that to happen. I would expect them to beat YDE. They're going to go to DRS. That's a team that, yeah, they lost to early on, but they played them close. They're going to go to North Shore. It'll be an interesting game. They're going to host TABC and they're going to go to Hafter. Going to Hafter, I'm just going to start with that because that's the most recent game that they played was that Hafter played close with Hank for the majority of that game. It wasn't until the end that Hank pulled away. And I think it could be a different story in Hafter potentially just because Hafter tends to play better at home, but we'll see. This Hank team still, like this Hank team was missing Elia at home. For all we know, if Elia Yitzhaki was in the lineup, there's a chance that maybe Hank beats them by more than 3 goals. Hank's going to host TABC. That's not going to be until February. So is that last Hafter game, by the way. Both of those games won't be until February. So it's possible they may not matter. But just in terms of what I would predict there, probably predict for Hank, just to play safe, I would go win over Hafter and I would go loss against TABC. But look, they're going to get North Shore, a team who I think they could definitely beat. They're going to get YD and Mag and David, teams I think they could beat. Right now, you got to remember, Hank is sitting at 5-3. I would expect them to get to at least the 8-win mark, which would guarantee them a winning season. And maybe even, who knows? Maybe they could surprise DRS. They played very close with them in the first game of the regular season that they played against each other. First of two, I should say. You go to the standings, and I'll include Flatbush and Rambam just because they're still in the playoff mix. Because other than that, Solomon Schechter and Mag and David both are, if not mathematically, well, Mag and David is mathematically eliminated, I believe, just because they can't get to 5 wins, and the teams in the 4 and 5 seed already have 5 wins, so they're mathematically out. Solomon Schechter is 1-7. They could still make it in, but I don't think that's very likely, especially with who they have coming up on the schedule. They're still going to play Flatbush. They're still going to play North Shore and YDE, teams that are in the playoff mix right now. I just can't see them getting in. But if you go back to the teams that are in the 6th and 7th spots right now, that's Flatbush and Rambam. I'll start with Rambam. I'd probably give them the lowest chance to get in. They're 3-6-1, so they could still go 7-6-0-1. But look, they've got a couple games against Flatbush coming up, a team that's also going to be fighting for the playoffs and a team that has just played very well against them with these specific groups of players over the last few years. They've got North Shore coming up, who's been a pretty consistently solid team throughout the regular season so far, and that game is going to be in North Shore. I would expect Rambam to probably take a loss there. I think they could beat Solomon Schechter coming up. That game is going to be also next week on Monday, and they're hosting that game, so I think that should be a game they grab. But other than that, I really can't see a record where they finish with more than 4, maybe 5 wins, depending on what happens against Flatbush and North Shore. But look, if they get to 7-6-1, maybe that could be enough, depending on what happens with the other teams that are in the standings. So we'll see what happens there. And that really wraps it up for the Eastern Conference. Now, if we go on towards the Western Conference, which is the last bit that we're going to talk about in terms of standings, what we're going to do is first we'll go through the standings there. So in the West, as of now, so Thursday night after the games that have happened, and this is an updated version, TABC is 9-0. Kushner's in second, and TABC is in first. Kushner's in second, they're 6-3-1. SAR is in third, they're 5-1 and 5-1-0-1. Frisch is in fourth, and they're 5-2, 0-1. MTA's in fifth, they're 5-3. And then those are the top five teams in the division, but we'll group Ramaz in there as well because they are just on the outside looking in. The bottom three teams in JEC, who's 0-7, Hillel, who's 1-8-1, and Ori Sral, who's 2-7-1. It's not looking great for these teams right now. Ori Sral automatically can't have a winning season. The best they could be is 6-7-1, and the best Hillel could be at this point is not 1-6-1, because right now they're 1-8-1. The best they could be is 5-8-1, and then you've got JEC who's 0-7. They could still go 7-7, but they don't exactly have the most favorable of schedules coming up. They're still going to have to play Kushner's in second, and still going to have to play MTA, who's going to be trying to lock up a playoff spot, and Ramaz, who's going to be trying to get in. So I can't see them getting into the playoffs. So right now, what we are looking at is a 1-6 in order of TABC, Kushner, SAR, Frisch, MTA, and then Ramaz. We'll start from the bottom and we'll work our way up. First of all, Ramaz. They've had more of a surprising season this year than they did 2 years ago, because 2 years ago they forfeited their season in JV. But they've played close with Kushner. They played a close game with TABC, a close game with SAR and North Shore. As I mentioned, they're playing close with the teams that seem to be above them, but they seem to give themselves a shot, even though they can't win these games. So it'll be interesting to see what happens going forward with them. And look, they're going to play Frisch and they're going to play SAR again, but MTA is a game. Who knows? Maybe they'll take that one. Maybe, they'll probably beat JEC. I'm looking at Ramaz right now. I'm saying I think I would predict them to go 6-8, but if they could squeeze a point or two out of the games that they're not necessarily favored to win in SAR, against SAR and against Frisch, which, by the way, they're both going to be at Ramaz. Maybe they'll surprise people. Maybe they'll get in, or maybe they'll move into a playoff spot, and we'll see what happens from there. Whether or not they clinch it, I don't know, but they could definitely move into a spot. You're looking now if you're going to go from 5 and up. So MTA, we'll group MTA and Frisch together just because they're very similar record wise. MTA right now is 5-3. They've got 6 games coming up, but you do need to remember so far that MTA also has not exactly gone up against the best of the competition so far. They've already played TABC, they've already played Frisch once, and other than and they've already had a game against Ramaz, they've already had a game against Kushner. But if you look at what they have coming up, another game against TABC, they've got a pair of games, or not a pair of games. They have a game against SAR, another one against Ramaz, and those are probably going to be games that I would assume they do drop or they very well could drop. MTA right now, I think they probably will hold on to that 5th spot. If I had to take a guess, I'd probably say Ramaz is the last team on the inside, or excuse me, on the outside looking just in and misses it by a point or two. But, we'll see what happens. But again, I wouldn't expect MTA to beat TABC, especially not in TABC, and that's where the game will be. I wouldn't expect them to beat SAR. What are they going to do against Ramaz? Fortunately for them, that happens to be the one game on Ramaz's schedule that's not in Ramaz. So it's fortunate for MTA. And we'll see what happens there. I think that MTA probably could end up with a record of about 8-6, 9-5. Are they gonna maybe lose a game in overtime somewhere? Who knows? We'll see. But I would expect them to still be in the playoffs. And then, as I mentioned, I'll talk about Frisch along with MTA. Frisch is just ahead of MTA in the standings right now. MTA is 5-3. Frisch is 5-2, 0-1. And the big news for Frisch is that they just tied SAR, a team that was favored to beat them. And not only did they tie SAR, but they tied SAR in SAR. So where it's interesting for me is, this Frisch team, something I didn't mention, but I guess I will mention, is they were most recently shut out by TABC prior to that SAR game. And that was the second game they played against TABC. So it's good for them that they got that out of their, off their schedule and out of their way. But right now, you're looking at it and you're saying, well, what we've done so far is we've played against TABC twice. We've played against Kushner twice, and Frisch took both games from Kushner. And now we just tied SAR. Frisch beat MTA badly. That was not like, crazy badly, but, they beat them 7-0. It was early on in the year. Again, I do think that when Frisch, is coming down the stretch to end their season, they've got 2 of the tougher games remaining in HAFTR and DRS. And that's going to be interesting to see what happens there. And right now, they've got a game going into Ramaz that'll be next week on Monday. A lot of good games coming up on Monday, December 16th, by the way. Just for reference, both JV and varsity common themes. So definitely check that out if you guys are able to. And whether you're going to them in person or on live stream, but that's just a separate point. Now that I'm realizing it. And SAR against Frisch is going to be in Frisch, and Frisch tied them in SAR. I mean, at this point, I don't think it would be as crazy to say that Frisch could beat SAR. I would still need to lean SAR. I do think they are the better team. They have the more talented team, but we've been surprised before. We've seen crazier things happen before, and it will not shock me if Frisch is able to beat SAR, especially after tying them in SAR, a place that's tough to beat. Now, were teams missing players, or did players have bad games? I mean, it's possible. I don't know. I wasn't there, and I wasn't able to watch a live stream, but based on what I heard, just a tough game that both teams really played hard in, and the result was a tie. So it'll be interesting to see what happens going forward from there. But I think Frisch and MTA, for the most part, as I mentioned, will end up in the playoffs. And I probably would predict, if I had to, that Frisch would finish above them. So MTA would be in fifth and Frisch would be in third, or excuse me, in fourth. Which brings us to the 3 spot where SAR is right now. And you know what? I'll do SAR and Kushner in the same tier, or not necessarily in the same tier. I'm not saying that's where they are together, but right now in the standings, they're right with each other. Right now, SAR is 5-1-0-1. As I mentioned, the most recent game for them, a tie to Frisch. And look, they've got Frisch coming up, so it's a chance at revenge for SAR, who thought maybe they should have taken that game at home against Frisch. They're going to go into MTA, a team I'd expect them to beat. They're going to get TABC at SAR, which I do think TABC is still the favorite going into that game. I would mark them down as the favorite going into that game. But SAR is not an easy place to play. And SAR, in my opinion, is the team that's really right behind TABC in the West, just in terms of individual players and, sort of the history we've seen between these teams because of what happened 2 years ago in JV. They're a talented, talented team. And but after that, SAR is going to go into Kushner. That's not going to be an easy game. They're going to play Kushner again, even in SAR. I know it'll probably benefit SAR more to have the game there, but that's not going to be an easy game. They're going to go to Ramaz at the end of the year. And keep in mind, not all these games happening immediately. They're going to play Frisch they're going to play Frisch in a week from this coming Sunday. And then the day right after that, which is a week from this coming Monday, they're going to play at MTA. Other than that, they're not going to be playing until January, mid-January, early to mid-January, and then they're not going to play until not late, but until early February. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with them. Again, I very much expect this team to end up in the playoffs. They've essentially clinched a spot, if not, they're going to. And with that being said, I think that they will end up jumping Kushner. As I did mention, this team is more talented than a team that's in third place at 5-1-0-1. Yes, they had a bit of a surprising result against Frisch, but I do think that they are better than 5-1-0-1. It wouldn't shock me to watch them go, like 12-1-0-1 or 11-2-0-1 or something like that, because I think they could beat Frisch coming up, and I think that they, theoretically could beat TABC, but yeah, at least in SAR. But I wouldn't exactly lock all of those things into happen. So we'll see what happens there. But I do think that they're going to be in the top 3 to finish off their season in terms of the regular season. And then we go ahead to Kushner. Kushner is 6-3-1, and they are in second place. Or excuse me, they're 6-3-0-1. They're in second place, and they've got 2 games against SAR coming up, as well as a game against TABC. They're going to play JEC. I would expect Kushner to at least end up with 7 wins, because I do think they're going to play. I do think they'll beat JEC even in JEC. But the interesting part for Kushner is that all of the rest of their games are not until January. So they've got some time off right now. Obviously just working on really everything, maybe looking over some games you've played in the past and saying, okay, we say we wanted a bit of a better result against against Frisch both times. What if we see them later on? What did we do well in that game? What didn't we do well in that game? Let's fine tune some things, because I very much do believe Kushner will be in the playoffs. The worst they could go at this point is 6-7-1. But I think that again, with the game coming up against JC, that the worst they will be is 7-6-1, which is very possible and probably what I think would happen because I don't think that they'll beat SAR or TABC. They've got three of their last four games against those teams. But again, you never know. Again, you never know, and it'll be interesting to see what happens there. But I do think they'll still end up. I think they've pretty much locked up a playoff spot. If not mathematically, then they will. They will, especially after playing JC, at least would be what I predict. And then finally, to close it out, we have TABC, who's 9-0. TABC only has 5 games left. They are the only team, or not the only team, but one of very few teams who have pretty much mathematically clinched a playoff spot at this point. But their schedule is not going to be an easy task to close out. And they're going to play DRS next week on a week from tonight on Thursday. They're going to play MTA after that. I think that's a team that, they really shouldn't be concerned with. No disrespect to MTA, it just happened early on. And look, the SAR at SAR is going to be a tough game for them. Hank at Hank is going to be a very interesting game. I'd say it could be a tough game for them. And, even playing Kushner, the team they just most recently beat 8-4. Again, like, yes, they scored 8 goals, but you're giving up 4 also. It's not like everything is perfect for them there. So, and that game is going to be at TABC, which I would say still favors them. But again, you just can't write teams off. So look, I do think that TABC is still probably going to lock up the 1 seed in the West and maybe even go undefeated. It's going to be seeing what happens against DRS, a week from tonight. It's going to be interesting to see what happens, obviously, when they go play Hank at Hank and when they get SAR at SAR. Those will be very interesting games to look out for what might potentially ruin a perfect season or an undefeated season for them. But, we'll see what happens once we get there. And then to close it out, I know that first we're going to do two things, but I know that I sort of just spoke about some of the recent games that most of these teams had played, but just to talk about some of the notable games there, as I mentioned, the Hank win over Hafter. This is back to both the league as a whole, so both Eastern Conference and Western Conference. But Hank beating Hafter without Elia and defeating them 5-2, albeit a close game still. SAR and Frisch tying 2-2. That was a very, from what I was told, was a very interesting game, and it's very, very, very recently removed. So we'll see what happens in the next game when they play each other. Other than that, Flatbush beating Hank earlier in the week, 6-5, and the word on the street was that Hank was missing a couple players, that they were missing Elia Hockey and Elon Kogel, who are, that's their first line offensive pairing right there. And I was also told Jojo Talit, who's a top pairing defense. So that's 3 of their 4 starters, on first line. That's and they still almost went and beat Flatbush. But look, they take a loss there that could potentially harm the way that the standings would have fallen out. Say if they could have been a 2 or 3 seed, maybe now they might end up being a 4 seed, or a 5 seed. We'll see. I still wouldn't panic if I were them. I think they're going to be in the playoffs, and no matter who they play when they're healthy, really, with the exception of a very, very, very small handful of teams, they could make noise. But just something interesting to hear, that Flatbush beat Hank 6-5. And other than that, the TABC, the most recent one, although maybe the score is not so interesting, but TABC defeating Frisch and sweeping them with a final score of 7-0 there in that game against them at TABC. So definitely some interesting games that took place and some interesting things to think about. I said they're not all exactly the most recent, but all happened since the production of the last episode or the releasing of the last episode. And then also in terms of some of the games that are coming up still. So some of the interesting ones, we're going to see DRS going to TABC on December 19th, on a week from tonight. That'll be a very interesting game. We're going to see Hafter going to DRS. That's going to be a very interesting game for them. I believe that game is on Monday, December 16th. We're going to see North Shore against Flatbush in it was a high-scoring game, 10-7 the first time. That could be a big game, not just for North Shore, but also for Flatbush, who right now is on the outside, the very outside looking in. Maybe they could get into the playoffs with a win there, jump over a team or two. And North Shore is going to drop a little bit in the standings and maybe open it up for a team like Hank or YDE to be able to jump them. And then finally, you're looking at the last game, at least, and these are all just, in terms of what I would mark down, but the last game between Hank and DRS, or I should say the second game between Hank and DRS. Hank and DRS played each other early on in the year, and DRS ended up winning that game, but it was a good game. I was there. It was at Hank on a Motzei Shabbos. Great game. DRS stormed out to an early lead, an early multi-goal lead. I believe it was 4-0. And then out of nowhere, Hank just scored 3 goals. I shouldn't say out of nowhere. They were in the game for the most part, and they couldn't get a couple bounces. And then, Hank went with 3 straight goals, Elia Itzhaki, Jojo Talit, and Elon Kogel all, managing to find the back of the net in ways. And, you know, it turned into a very, very close ending, even though DRS did win. So it'll be interesting to see. It'll be very interesting to see what unfolds throughout the rest of the regular season. And as I mentioned, none of these teams, or very few of these teams, have set destinies so far, at least in terms of the regular season, if they're, on the very outs on the just looking in from the out, or excuse me, just on the outside looking into the playoff picture, or if they're, all the way at the top, whether it be in JV or in varsity. So it'll be interesting to see what happens on, in both leagues. And with that being said, this is where we're going to wrap it up for the third episode of the Yeshiva League Pass Hockey Podcast episode. So I want to thank you all for tuning into this episode of the Hockey Podcast from Yeshiva League Pass. And again, I want to thank our sponsor, the Weiselberg Law Firm, for sponsoring. And remember, everyone, that they are the Weiselberg Law Firm. Please choose wisely.